Hello and you're welcome to the Big Tech Show with me, Adrian Weckler. Now, is 6G really going to happen, or was 5G too much of a flop for operators to take the plunge? Also, we're going to look at the market being flooded by Chinese phone brands like TCL and Oppo and Xiaomi and others. And we're going to ask, are any of them any good? Because I've been reviewing some of them. And we're going to take an initial look at the launch of the iPad Air. We're also expecting a MacBook Air. But first, JJ Clark, I spent about 2 days this week at Mobile World Congress, which is the biggest telecoms get-together in the world. Giant conference, probably 5 or 6 times bigger than the Web Summit. It's equivalent in size to the likes of IFA or CES. But of all the stuff that was being discussed, we had AI, we had security, we had new smartphones, we had next generation technology. The one topic that nobody seemed to be discussing much was 6G. And this is curious to me because I've covered the launches of 3G, 4G, 5G, and we're now 5 or 6 years into 5G, and no one's talking about 6G. And I spoke to a bunch of people from some of the big operators and the big network companies, and they say privately there just isn't much interest in it.
Why is there no interest in it?
Because 5G was just such a flop. Now, let me just back up a second just to say what I'm talking about with 5G and 6G. I think we know what 5G is at this point. You get it as it's the default standard network on any smartphone now. Roughly speaking, you get slightly faster speeds than you do on 4G. Nobody has figured out a use for 5G applications, even 5 years after the launch. 6G is supposed to be the next iteration. So when we talk about 6G, sixth generation, we mean faster again. We mean lower latency again, which means, again, a lower response time. So when we talked about all these self-driving cars and remote brain surgery that could be done over 5G, none of that has actually happened.
Right.
But with 6G, they're saying that, well, all of these things can happen, and also we will have, a boost for things like artificial intelligence wearables, health AI, all that sort of stuff. So we're starting to get a shopping list of theoretical stuff that will be possible with 6G. For that to happen, for 6G to be built out, the operators and others need to spend billions and billions and billions of euro upgrading their networks, because it's probably going to be at higher frequencies, which means new equipment. It might mean more equipment for it to be effective. So it's really interesting that 5G has kind of been a flop. I've been calling this for the last 4 or 5 years. Yeah. Even today in 2025, there's no mobile operator in Ireland or elsewhere who could actually quantify and specify what it is that 5G does that 4G or 3G, 4G does not do.
What are the infrastructure requirements, like the physical requirements that have to go into setting up 5G and 6G?
Just upgrading the network, new kit, new frequencies that have to be accounted for. Because it's a higher frequency, that's the conversation at the moment. It's likely there'll be shorter distances. Now, there are variations on that conversation. They have to set the 6G standard. It's an organization called the GSM Association. Used to have a very prominent office in Dublin. I think they still do have an office in Dublin, but it's based in London. And they get together. It's a bunch of major operators. They get together and their engineers sort out what the next standard is going to be for the next faster, better network. So one of the things they're talking about is a higher frequency of spectrum, which basically likely means they'll need more base stations. Then there might be smaller base stations. So
base stations are like pylons, or what?
Yeah, they can be little aerials. They can be little. You'll see them at the top of mountains. You'll see them at the top of public buildings. In a city like Dublin, you'll see them on the top of a lot of them on the top of buildings. Controversy every time they try and put them in small towns because some crank says that it's within 2 kilometers of a school and all the kids are going to die of cancer. That's the conversation we always get into. 3G, 4G, 5G. With 5G was probably the worst that we saw. All the conspiracy theorist nuts came out and said that, might give you cancer. We actually had, in a sort of a goodwill effort on this podcast, I had one of the leading 5G skeptics to air what his views. This is a guy who has an academic background And he was drawing crowds of like 150, 200 people. He was on a roadshow around Ireland. He was drumming up a lot of worry and discontent about 5G and the effects. And I spoke to some of the people who went to those events, and they said they were nervous and they were worried about their children's health. And it was mostly nonsense.
Right.
There are some studies which suggest that mobile phone radiation in general, that the jury's out, that there might be long-term effects. We don't know what the ultimate long-term effects, but the vast majority of sensible, rational studies have concluded that, you know, the risk is minimal.
Right.
From 5G, as it was from 4G, as it was from 3G.
And just if we play out, what innovation gets stunted if 6G does not become a reality for the average punter?
We don't know. That's the problem. So one of the questions I was putting to executives from Ericsson, Nokia, T-Mobile, Docomo, these are giant companies that are heavily involved in setting the standards, building the equipment and rolling the stuff out. One of the questions was, well, what are we actually going to see with 6G? What is it that you're telling us we're going to have? And they were very wishy-washy on it. And there was a guy from Meta there who is their head of mobile networks. His name is Juji. He said that he thought that it would help their products like wearables, AI wearables, glasses, smart glasses, things like that. But he pointed out, Meta's going to launch those products in the next 18 months anyway. And we won't have 6G till at least 2031, 2032. It's around that time that it's due to start coming, on stream. So he couldn't say what we would have, what kind of effects we would have either. The guy from Docomo that I spoke to was actually interesting. He spoke a lot more about very future orientated products and services, like kind of neural interfaces and things like that.
Okay.
So where the requirement was for low power and super fast latency. So that if you have, let's say, for example, I was talking to one company that is building smart contact lenses that can show you what's happening as your eye is moving. Now, that's super fast latency you need for that.
Right.
So maybe a 6G network could do something like that. But that's about the best it gets.
That sounds like Minority Report. Like that's the one that's trotted out all the time.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the tech they're building anyway is like Minority Report. But
just one thing before you mentioned in your article about the telecoms companies paying out like a vast, it's not
billions.
proportionate, to the
100 billion in Europe.
Yeah, like to the
what
services
they paid out for 5G licenses, 5G build out, 5G provisioning, and all the rest.
As opposed to Google and Meta and all these social media companies, and just what the user is actually using for these licenses and on their phones. Is that point in there to point out that like maybe there should be like the services that are being used should be feeding into that cost as well?
I mean, the networks, the mobile and telecoms networks have been making an argument for over a decade that the likes of Google and Amazon and Netflix should be paying them for the infrastructure because they're the ones ultimately who are benefiting. That was always a very weak argument. What that really is an argument. It's a little bit like what the newspapers and the publishing industry were trying to argue with Google and Meta, that, our stories are, being shared on your social media platforms. Therefore, you should pay us over and above. Now, I'm quite unpopular with some of my colleagues in saying that's a nonsense argument. Always has been a nonsense argument. The company we work for and other publishers are part of an industry that did deals with the likes of Google and others. I think that's a one-off thing. I very much doubt we'll ever see that again. I think that moment has passed. But I mean, if you look at the value, for example, of the telecoms companies, so 10 years ago, when 5G was about to be launched, it was in the last, just a year or two before it was launched, Vodafone, O2 and Hutchison Whampoa, who owns Three, had a combined market value of about 140 billion euro. Today, it's about 40 billion euro. So the value of telecoms companies, with a few exceptions, T-Mobile has done well, but generally speaking, the value of telecoms has either stagnated or gone down in that same period. Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Meta, Netflix, take your pick. They've all tripled or quadrupled in value. So telecoms has stagnated. If you had any telecoms shares in your pension portfolio, you've been tearing your hair out over the last few years. And the problem with 6G here is that's important, because for 6G to be built out, the big operators, the Vodafones, the T-Mobiles, others, they are going to have to invest billions. And in some cases, they're going to go to investors and say, will you give us a few billion to build out 6G? And the investor will be looking at 5G and thinking, why on earth would we do that? Like, not only can you not tell us what services will be used over it, but we now know that whoever makes money out of it, it won't be you. It'll be some other service that makes money out of it. So why on earth would we fund 6G? So I think there is a very real risk that we either may not see 6G or we won't see it in the normal time frame, normal upgrade time frame, because we should be seeing the first 6G implementation by 2030, according to 2032. According to how the generations go. But it wouldn't surprise me if it wasn't till 2037, 2038, 2040 maybe. And even then it's up in the air.
Unless they can kind of find a really good use case that they can hang their hat off and say, like, this is what we're going to sell you to. But as of yet, we don't. No, it's not obvious.
No, and we're still trying to catch up with 5G. I'll say it again. If you talk to any mobile operator in Ireland, what 5G is used for, they'll start reverting into bland cliches, and they won't be able to give you a specific use case that could be for 5G as opposed to 4G. Yeah. The best argument I've heard is that, well, if you are close to a 5G mast, and you get higher speeds from that than you would from a 4G speed. Like maybe you get 250, 300 megabits per second, maybe. Now, you'd be lucky to get that from a 5G mast at this point. Maybe that's twice as much as you'd get from 4G, and maybe you have 3 or 4 people in the house that are, someone's gaming, and maybe that helps to distribute the speed. That's the best I've heard. And that's in an era when the vast majority of Ireland now gets access to fibre. So it's a redundant argument anyway. Anyway, from that, there's our public service section of the podcast done. From that, I'm going to look at Chinese brands and phone brands, because it's really interesting. A company called Xiaomi, which many listeners may not have even heard of. It's the 3rd biggest smartphone brand in the world. It makes things like scooters. It just announced a car, an EV, at Mobile World Congress. It makes laptops. It makes all sorts of tech, speakers. They just launched their Xiaomi 15 phone and 15 Ultra phones into Ireland. And they're one of a bunch of smartphone brands which are now starting to make, you're starting to see them in the Harvey Normans, the Currys. You're starting to see them in the DIDs, the Power Cities, and with the operators. I'm talking about the likes of Xiaomi, Oppo. Honor is making quite an incursion into the Irish market, brands like TCL as well. And the funny thing about these brands is that these are among the biggest phone companies in the world. So if you actually look at who the big 5 or the big 6 are in the world, it's Apple and Samsung are always 1 and 2. Okay. And then after that, you're talking about Xiaomi, you're talking about Oppo, then you're looking at brands like Vivo. This is kind of weird because in Ireland and in Europe and the States, it's a duopoly. It's really only 2 brands. It's Apple and Samsung. And maybe you might say Google Pixel has come into sort of established a kind of a 3rd position, anywhere between 6 and maybe 12 or 13%, depending on the country. But China's where all the factories are made are for phones. So that's where all the phones are made. So I've been reviewing a bunch of these phones, and the Xiaomi 15 is a really interesting example because it's a really high-end smartphone that if you picked it up, if you put a Samsung or an Apple badge on it, you'd say, this is a beautiful phone. This is fantastic. But because it's Xiaomi, I don't think anyone will buy it.
Why is that?
because it costs too much. So anyone who has a Xiaomi phone in Ireland at the moment, it's the likes of its Redmi Note, it's mid-range or budget phone. So Redmi Note 13 or 13T or 14T. These are phones that typically cost, you know, 299, 399, 479 euro, that kind of price range.
Right.
The Xiaomi 15 flagship smartphone starts in Ireland at 1099, 1100 euro.
Right.
It's 20 euro more expensive for the same amount of storage as Samsung's Galaxy S25. Now, Ireland is a duopoly between Samsung and Apple. If you're going to buy an Android phone, a premium Android phone, overwhelmingly it's going to be a Samsung. So you're now asking people who were going to buy an S25 with 512 gigabytes of storage to spend 20 euro more to buy a Xiaomi.
And it's also a punt because the
and it's, by the way, it's not a better phone than the S25. I mean, it's as good a phone.
Yeah.
And it feels fantastic in the hand. It's great screen, really good cameras, really good battery life. I mean, it is a top flagship phone, no question about it. You could argue it's worth the money. I'm just saying no one's going to buy it.
But it's also because it's an unknown quantity. You go to like any shop in the world, any convenience store, and there's be Coca-Cola, and the chances of you trying something new that's the exact same price, and even if someone said, "Oh, it's as good as Coca-Cola," the recognition.
Try for a novelty, and you try it if it costs like €2.50. I mean, if that if you're in that context,
right
now there is one exception. I mean, Xiaomi has the Xiaomi 15 and has the Xiaomi 15 Ultra. Now, the Ultra phone, which is priced at $15.99 in Ireland, but it has one absolute ace card which a particular segment might be interested in. That is, it has a 1-inch sensor for its cameras, which no other phone on the market has, in the Irish market, has this. It has two individual telephoto lenses. So if you're into cameras on your phone, if it's a big deal for you, this is the be all and end all of camera phones, the Xiaomi 15 Ultra. There's no question about that. But it's $15.99. Again, you're talking about Samsung S25 Ultra prices. Now, unless you are really willing to take a punt, I don't know if anyone's going to buy that either.
And is the implication with when it comes to Chinese-made phones? I know you said at the outset that all the factories for the phones are there in China anyway, but the made in China tag, I always see that. This is maybe coming out of ignorance, but as lower quality.
No. So every single smartphone you use is made in China. So the iPhone 16 Pro Max is made in China.
Right.
Every single phone. I mean, Tim Cook had this famous answer to the question as to why stuff was made in China. And he said, look, a lot of people misunderstand this in terms of being a budgetary issue or price is cheap. He said, it's nothing to do with that. It's to do with engineering, spec and product design. He said, if you were to gather together all of the product engineering design experts in America, you'd probably, fit them into a large sort of conference room. In China, you'd need a football stadium. So there's simply way more skill there. They're much better at making things because they've much more experience. They've way more people doing it. So when you look at, if you take, for example, Nothing's phone. So Nothing is a brand. Carl Pei, the OnePlus founder, they have a couple of new phones, the 3A, the 3A Pro. These are budget to mid-range price phones, 450, 550 euro. But if you look at the detail on them, they're absolutely fantastic. Really, really nice. And I mean, they're made in China as well.
Right.
So that's the reason that all phones are made in China. Now, a small handful of them are starting to be made in Vietnam or India, but generally speaking, the high end of skills for manufacturing, for really intricate, highly skilled stuff is in China.
And the other concern I would have when it comes to a Xiaomi or an Oppo phone is, where's my data going? My privacy.
That's a really interesting one. In that there isn't any. There's no suggestion that by using an Oppo phone or a Xiaomi phone or a TCL phone or a Realme phone or a ZTE phone or a Poco phone, that this is going back to China, with the exception that in some cases, we're not entirely sure where the phone's own brand browsers, how they operate in terms of those phone companies' headquarters and their data center provisions. But if you buy, say, a Xiaomi phone, and if you stick with Google on it, Google Chrome, Gmail, etc., I don't think there is a question of the data going back to China. There may be in terms of registering the phone, in terms of the setup process. But you're right to point this out because obviously that's what killed Huawei. So Huawei was solid number 3 phone brand in US and in Western Europe and in Ireland. I mean, a lot of people, a lot of listeners to this podcast may still have a Huawei P30 Pro, which was a game-changing phone. P20 Pro actually was a game-changing phone, and the P30 Pro was magnificent, easily the best Android phone at the time. And it got too popular. And then geopolitical stuff kicked in. Huawei also was were rolling out 5G networks at the time. They had a lot of routers, broadband routers. They still do. A lot of geopolitical stuff kicked in, and the US banned Google from allowing Huawei to use its Play Store. That killed Huawei phones in Europe, killed the Huawei phones in the States. Didn't kill Huawei, though, at all. Huawei is doing really well if you look at their results. Their last results, they still have quite a substantial base here in Ireland, by the way. They employ hundreds of people in R&D. But the question is, if the likes of Oppo or Xiaomi or TCL or any of those, if they do make serious incursions, let's say they get above 10% in brand, will similar geopolitical considerations kick in? And it's a very good open-ended question, and probably a good bet that they might.
Right.
If you look at what's happened to TikTok, for example.
Yes.
I mean, TikTok is a Singapore-based company, but its parent company, ByteDance, is based in China. And we know that there's a ban in the offing in the US. We know that the second-order effects of that are being felt in Europe. Civil servants aren't allowed. Public sector employees are not allowed. I think they're not allowed to have TikTok on their work-issued phones. I know we have Simon Harris TikToking all the time.
Right.
But I think I think there's a loophole there. He tries to...
Personal phone.
And also because the whole rules are nonsense. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Banning people from using TikTok when the Taoiseach and sometimes Taoiseach is TikToking away, sometimes from within government buildings. It's ridiculous, that guidance that came from National Cybersecurity Centre here. And Simon Harris's use of TikTok makes an absolute joke of it.
And is there a case for, as you mentioned, Apple and Samsung are always 1 and 2. Are they, from a business standpoint, they'd be in favour of that alarm bell getting rung once a Chinese phone company goes over 10%?
Yeah, they actively lobby on that basis. So Meta, for example, was very active over the last few years lobbying against TikTok. And one of the quivers in its, one of the arrows in its quiver, I almost mixed up my metaphors there, was that Meta was an American company and TikTok was essentially a Chinese-owned company. And they've long used that argument. When I ask Samsung directly, for example, when I ask the UK-based directors about that and about the effects from Huawei and everything, it's kind of like a little wry smile and a wink. And they won't say, well, we're delighted about it, but they're delighted about it because that essentially gives them hegemony in Western markets. Now, for how long, I don't know. Apple will be there for a long time. How long will Samsung be there? That's less clear. I mentioned brands like Nothing. I mentioned Google Pixel phones are doing very, very well. But the Chinese are coming and the phones are good. They're good phones. They're good value phones. The question is, will people be willing to take a punt on them? And at the moment, for anyone looking for a premium phone, the answer is not really, even though the phones are really, really good. At the lower end, though, absolutely. I would say that the operators and the main retailers are selling quite a lot of them. Before we go, we'll just mention the iPad Air. There's a new iPad Air and a new iPad. There's 2 new iPads. And honestly, I'll come back with a a bigger review, and watch out for on independent.ie for an in-depth review for anyone who cares about it. I don't have the unit yet. I will have at some point, but just looking at the figures and the statistics, I don't know there's much to talk about here.
Right. Was there like, as in,
chip.
what's different and how much did it cost? Yeah.
There's a new chip. There's a new chip. There's the Apple Intelligence. There's a new case. There's a new Magic Keyboard case for the iPad Air, which, by the way, also works for previous iPad Air devices. But it's it's €300 or €400 the case.
Okay.
The iPad Air itself starts at I think $729. So, and there's a new iPad as well, a new lower end iPad that doesn't have one of the M series chips. So the new iPad Air has, I believe it's an M3 chip. The lower level iPad uses the old iPhone chip, the Bionic, the A16 chip. So it doesn't have Apple Intelligence. Mm-hmm. So that's really all there is to say about it. Same size, same weight, same screen, same camera.
But Irish users won't be able to use that Apple Intelligence.
April is when it's being launched. So as I said, we will have more on that. And we are also expecting, by the time you hear this, it may have already been announced, we're expecting the launch of a MacBook Air, a new MacBook Air as well. So that is all we have time for. JJ Clark produced this episode. Gav Hennessy was on sound, and I'm Adrian Weckler. And you've been listening to or watching The Big Tech Show. We'll talk to you soon.